Welcome to Sleepy Scholar, where time slows down and history becomes a lullaby. Come sit beside me here by the crackling fire. The light is low, the world is quiet, and the past is waiting to whisper its stories. Rest your head, get cozy, and let's drift gently across the vast, shimmering oceans, following the quiet voyage of a man named Cristopher Columbus, whose journey would quietly change the course of the world. In the gentle morning light of Genoa, a city by the sea, a boy was born who would one day sail beyond the horizon. His name was Cristoforo Colombo, though the world would come to know him as Christopher Columbus. The year was 1451, and Genoa, nestled along the Ligurian coast of what is now Italy, bustled with the rhythm of trade and tide. Narrow alleys curled like ribbons through stone buildings, and ships from distant lands filled a harbor with the whispered tales of faraway places. Christopher was the son of a wool weaver named Domenico Colombo and his wife, Susanna Fontanarossa. The family lived modestly, their days filled with the soft clatter of looms and the salty breath of the sea. Though they were not wealthy, the Colombos valued knowledge and curiosity, and young Christopher, with wide eyes and an eager mind, soaked in every detail of the world around him. From the windows of his childhood, Christopher could see the sails of merchant ships unfurling like wings. He often walked along the harbor, where sailors told stories of golden cities, jeweled islands, and lands beyond the maps. These tales planted gentle seeds of wonder in his heart. It was here, in the quiet wonder of his youth, that Christopher's dreams first took shape. Dreams of oceans and stars, of unseen coasts and silent tides. Education came in bits and pieces. Columbus likely attended a local school for a time, learning Latin, geometry, and astronomy, the foundational tools of navigation. But much of his learning came from the sea itself. As a teenager, he found work on trading vessels, and it wasn't long before he was drawn into the life of a sailor. These early voyages took him along the Mediterranean, where he learned the moods of the sea, the pull of the current, and the stars that guided travelers at night. In these gentle voyages, he became familiar with the wind and weather, with the sway of the deck beneath his feet, and the way sails sang in a breeze. He saw the ports of Corsica and Tunisia, perhaps even ventured as far as the British Isles. And with each journey, his confidence grew, not with bravado, but with quiet certainty. It is easy to imagine the young Columbus standing at the bow of a ship at twilight, watching the sun melt into the sea, the sky turning lavender and gold. He would have listened to the older sailors, absorbing their stories, their warnings, their wisdom. They spoke of the edge of the world, of monsters in the deep, and of lands rich with spices and silk. But in Columbus's mind, these tales did not stir fear. They stirred purpose. In the soft candlelight of quiet evenings, perhaps in a small room filled with maps and manuscripts, Columbus would study the works of ancient scholars, Ptolemy, Marco Polo, and Arab geographers who hinted at lands not yet seen. Though the prevailing belief was that the Atlantic was vast and unknowable, Columbus began to wonder, what if the world was smaller than they thought? What if Asia lay just beyond the western horizon? As years passed, this question gently persisted. It became a kind of lullaby in his mind, a thought that soothed and beckoned. The earth, he believed, was not a boundless mystery, but a curved path waiting to be walked, and in time he would seek to follow it. Though his path was not yet clear and the oceans not yet crossed, the boy from Genoa was already on his journey. With every sunrise over the harbor, with every creaking voyage to neighboring shores, Columbus was quietly preparing. His heart held the quiet certainty of someone who knew that one day the sails would rise not just to travel, but to discover. And so, beneath the sky that arched over Genoa, in the lull of the waves and the hush of the wind, the story of Christopher Columbus began. Not with ships or crowns, but with a boy, a dream, and the sea. As Christopher Columbus grew into manhood, the sea remained his quiet companion. His youthful dreams had matured into focused curiosity, and his voyages had expanded his view of the world. The Mediterranean, once a vast and unfamiliar expanse, had become a familiar passage. He moved with gentle confidence, charting his course by stars and instinct, listening to the soft language of the ocean. By the early 1470s, Columbus had left Genoa behind. Like many seafarers of the time, he sought new opportunities in Portugal, a kingdom flourishing with maritime ambition. Lisbon, Portugal's coastal capital, welcomed sailors and scholars alike. It was a city where the sea was not feared, but studied. Maps adorned tables like precious tapestries, and the conversation often turned to voyages past and those yet to come. In Lisbon, Columbus found not just work, but community. He sailed with merchant fleets bound for England and perhaps even Iceland, braving the northern waters where ice drifted silently and daylight lingered late. These journeys were challenging, but they tempered his resolve like steel forged slowly in flame. He learned not only how to navigate the seas, but how to observe, to calculate, and to quietly question what others accepted as fact. He married Filipa Moniz Perestrello, a woman of noble Portuguese descent. Her family had ties to the island of Porto Santo, part of the Madeira archipelago. There, Columbus lived for a time surrounded by the endless horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. From the shores of that remote island, the idea of lands across the sea seemed closer, not as myth, but as possibility. Columbus became increasingly absorbed by the science of navigation. He studied the winds and currents that flowed westward along the coast of Africa and across the open ocean. He examined the maps of his day, speculative, often incomplete, but filled with clues. He read classical texts and recent accounts of distant lands, including the writings of Marco Polo, which painted vivid images of wealth in the East, of golden cities, fragrant spices, and silks that shimmered in the sun. But while many believed that the journey to Asia required a long voyage around Africa and the Indian Ocean, Columbus began to think differently. He believed the Earth was smaller than most scholars claimed. If one could sail directly west from Europe, he reasoned, one might reach Asia in fewer days than expected. It was a gentle yet persistent belief, born not of recklessness, but of careful thought and quiet conviction. He began to sketch plans for a voyage. The route would take him westward, across the unbroken blue of the Atlantic, to the lands he believed lay just beyond the horizon. It was not a quest for adventure, but for knowledge, and, yes, for trade. Columbus envisioned new paths for commerce, new connections between worlds, and the possibility of peaceful exchange. But for a sailor, no matter how skilled, such a voyage could not begin without support. Ships, supplies, and men were needed. Columbus would need to convince someone with power and means to fund his idea, a monarch willing to invest in dreams. In Portugal, he approached the royal court. His proposals were met with interest, but also with skepticism. The court's advisors debated the size of the Earth, the dangers of the Atlantic, and the likelihood of success. They concluded politely that the risks were too great. Still, Columbus did not lose hope. With quiet determination, he left Portugal and journeyed to Spain. There, too, he presented his ideas, his charts, and his reasoning. He walked the halls of power with patience, making his case with humility and care. For years, he waited. At times, he stayed in monasteries, places of reflection and peace. The monks offered him shelter and sometimes counsel, and Columbus, in those still moments, refined his plans. Word of his ideas reached Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, the monarchs who would soon complete the unification of Spain. At first, they declined his proposal, but something about Columbus, his quiet confidence, his vision, or perhaps the promise of what lay beyond, stayed with them. They did not dismiss him entirely, and in time, after long deliberation, they agreed to fund a voyage unlike any other. Columbus's dream was no longer just his own. It had become a shared hope, one whispered between waves and stars, held gently in the hands of those who dared to believe. By the soft light of candlelit halls and the echo of footsteps on polished stone, Christopher Columbus's voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who had waited patiently for his moment. After years of wandering, proposing, and refining his ideas, he now stood at the threshold of possibility. The court of Spain, where royalty and reason often intertwined, had begun to truly consider his westward vision. It was the late 1480s, and Columbus had become a familiar figure in the Spanish royal circles. His clothes were simple, his manner earnest, and his presence steady. He did not dazzle with pageantry or grand words. Instead, he spoke calmly of stars, sea currents, and a path across the Atlantic, not to the edge of the world, but to the rich lands of Asia. The monarchs, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, had much to consider. Their court was alive with diplomatic concerns. Spain had only recently seen the tide of the Reconquista rise, with Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, yet to fall. Funds and focus were stretched, and Columbus's proposal, though intriguing, competed with more immediate matters of state. Still, Columbus lingered in the background like a gentle breeze, not forgotten. He spent quiet days waiting in nearby towns or cloisters, often at La Rabida, a peaceful monastery where friars lent their ears and insight. He remained steadfast, not pushing too hard, simply ready when the moment came. At long last, in 1492, a year of great turning, the stars aligned. Granada fell, uniting Spain under Christian rule, and with this new sense of purpose, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand revisited Columbus's petition. After renewed deliberation, and with voices both for and against, they gave their consent. It was not a lavish agreement. Columbus would receive 3 ships, modest in size, and a crew drawn from a mixture of seasoned sailors and hopeful adventurers. Yet the terms were generous in their own way. Should he succeed, Columbus would be granted the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and named governor of any lands he might discover. It was a quiet promise made under high ceilings and tapestries, a compact sealed not by spectacle, but by mutual trust and vision. The ships were small but capable. The Nina and the Pinta were caravels, swift and light, well suited for exploration. The third, the Santa Maria, was larger, a sturdy nail with a deeper hold. She would be Columbus's flagship, a vessel of simple grace. In the port town of Palos de la Frontera, preparations began. Supplies were gathered: salted meat, fresh water, hardtack, wine, and dried legumes. Navigational tools were packed with care: astrolabes, compasses, and charts drawn by hand. Ropes were coiled, sails tested, and timbers checked. The harbor echoed with the quiet clatter of preparation and the hum of low conversation. The crew assembled was a patchwork of experience. Some were skilled mariners, others driven by curiosity or the hope of reward. There were murmurs of fear of monsters, of empty seas, of falling off the edge of the world. But Columbus, with his calm demeanor and thoughtful explanations, reassured them gently. The ocean, he believed, was not a place of chaos, but of patterns and purpose. Before departure, Columbus wrote carefully in his journal, noting his intentions and observations. He was methodical, not rushing the moment. In the hush of early August, the three ships slipped from the harbor, their sails billowing like quiet prayers to the wind. As they set out, Columbus stood at the helm, his eyes on the horizon. Behind him lay Europe, familiar and known. Ahead was an open canvas of blue, wide and uncertain. The sea did not roar that day. It murmured, a soft whisper, beneath wooden hulls and fluttering flags. The voyage had begun not with fanfare, but with focus. In those first days, Columbus kept a steady hand, speaking kindly to his crew and watching the stars each night for signs. The rhythm of ship life began to settle, the creak of ropes, the scent of salt, the slow rise and fall of the waves, all part of a new, floating world. The court of kings had given him permission, but it was the sea, ever vast and quiet, that would now decide the course. And so, with gentle resolve, Columbus and his companions sailed westward into the unknown, not in search of conquest or fame, but to follow a dream that had been patiently nurtured under the roofs of monasteries and the vaulted ceilings of Spain's royal chambers. The morning of August 3rd, 1492, arrived with soft light over the waters of Palos de la Frontera. As the sun warmed the sails, three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, glided quietly away from the Spanish coast, their wooden hulls cutting through the calm waters. They did not carry armies nor treasures, but hopes, the steady hopes of men embarking on a voyage into the wide, waiting sea. For Cristopher Columbus, this was a moment years in the making. Though his eyes were fixed forward, his thoughts may have wandered gently backward to Genoa's harbors, to the quiet study of stars, and to the soft-spoken promises made in royal courts. Now, all had come together in these floating vessels, pushed gently by the breath of the wind. The Atlantic stretched ahead, open and wide. In those days, much of it remained unmapped and unknown. The crew knew this. Some feared the sea would go on forever, that they would never find land. But the days passed, one by one, and Columbus remained calm. Each night, he observed the stars, noting their quiet procession across the sky. Each morning, he recorded the ship's position, noting the winds and currents with quiet precision. Life aboard the ships unfolded in slow, measured rhythms. The decks creaked softly underfoot. The sails flapped gently above. Men took turns keeping watch, steering the tiller, or preparing simple meals. They ate salted meat, dry biscuits, and legumes softened with seawater. Rain was collected for drinking, and when storms passed, the ships rocked like cradles in the wind. Columbus kept 2 logs. One contained the true distance traveled for his own records. The other, shown to the crew, offered a gentler version with shorter distances. He did this not to deceive, but to ease the minds of those aboard. Men who feared each mile took them farther from the safety of home. In his own heart, Columbus believed land lay ahead. He trusted in the currents, the skies, and the quiet science of navigation. The wind guided them steadily westward. They passed through what sailors called the Sargasso Sea, a region where golden seaweed drifted silently across the surface. It was unlike anything they had seen. For some, it was a sign they were approaching land. For others, it was a reminder of how far they had come. Weeks passed. September turned to October. Doubt stirred among the men, quietly at first, then with more urgency. Yet Columbus remained composed. He spoke gently to his crew, promising they were close. He pointed to signs, drifting wood, flocks of birds, and changes in the water's color. These subtle clues, he believed, whispered of shores nearby. Then, in the quiet hours before dawn on October 12th, a sailor aboard the Pinta called out. He had seen something, a faint outline in the distance, land. Columbus had promised they would find it, and now, after over 2 months at sea, it rose from the ocean like a dream. As daylight spread across the water, they approached the island. Its beaches were white and smooth, kissed by gentle waves. Palm trees swayed in the breeze, and birds flew overhead, their wings glinting in the sun. The land was lush and green, unfamiliar yet welcoming. Columbus named it San Salvador. The men disembarked slowly, some kneeling to touch the earth. Columbus stepped ashore with quiet reverence. He carried the royal banner of Spain. But in that moment, it was not conquest he felt. It was wonder, a moment suspended between dreams and reality. The inhabitants of the island watched with curiosity and calm. These were the Taino people, kind and graceful, offering gifts and gestures of welcome. There was no battle, no thunder of guns, only exchange, observation, and cautious smiles. Columbus noted their generosity, their ornaments, and their openness. He believed still that he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. He did not know that he had arrived at the edge of a new continent, a place that would change the course of history. For now, he saw only beauty, potential, and peace. Over the next weeks, the ships visited nearby islands, Cuba and Hispaniola, each with its own rhythms of life, each rich with new scents, sights, and sounds. The voyage was not without difficulty, but Columbus remained measured in his approach, documenting his experiences with care. The Santa Maria would later run aground, gently lost to the sea. A small settlement was left behind, and in early 1493, Columbus began his return to Spain, sailing eastward with news of the journey and of lands touched by morning light and ocean breeze. In the early months of 1493, the ocean once more cradled the ships that had carried Cristopher Columbus into the unknown. Now they turned homeward, their sails gently filled with wind, their decks holding more than men and cargo. They carried stories, memories, and the quiet echo of discovery. The return journey was not simple. The sea, ever vast and unpredictable, offered both calm and storm. One tempest in particular struck with sudden force, battering the Nina and her sister ship. Waves rose like slow mountains, and wind pulled at sails with impatient hands. But Columbus remained steady. His knowledge of the sea, his care in navigation, and the cohesion of his crew helped the ships endure. As the storm faded, so did the worry. With each passing day, the familiar skies of Europe drew nearer. On March 15th, 1493, the Niña arrived in Palos de la Frontera, the very port from which it had departed just months before. The people of the town gathered to witness the quiet miracle. A voyage thought impossible had returned not only with its crew, but with proof of lands across the sea. Columbus was welcomed as a hero. He carried with him objects from the islands, brightly colored feathers, small trinkets, and notes of gold. More importantly, he brought tales of peaceful people, fertile lands, and the promise of new opportunities. His calm retelling of the voyage sparked wonder in listeners from every corner of Spain. Soon, he was summoned to Barcelona to meet again with Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. He traveled slowly, received warmly in each village and town along the way. Children gathered to hear about the journey, and elders offered quiet blessings. When he arrived at court, the monarchs greeted him with honor and gratitude. They listened with care as Columbus described the journey, the winds and currents, the distant islands, the people he had met. His tone remained measured, never boastful. He did not shout of conquest, nor raise his voice in triumph. Instead, he shared, thoughtfully and with deep respect, the simple facts of what he had seen. The monarchs were pleased. Spain, still glowing from its recent unification, saw in Columbus's voyage a new beginning, not only for exploration, but for the growth of knowledge, trade, and influence. They granted him titles, wealth, and permission to prepare for further expeditions. Plans were already in motion for a second voyage, one that would include more ships, more men, and the intention to establish lasting presence in the lands he had touched. Yet Columbus, amid the celebrations and promises, remained contemplative. He knew that the journey ahead would not be the same as the one behind. The first voyage had been a step into mystery, guided by faith in stars and sea. What followed would be more complex, shaped by expectation, politics, and the needs of kingdoms. Still, he was ready. He believed that what he had begun was more than a voyage. It was a thread connecting distant peoples and lands. He imagined peaceful trade, shared knowledge, and mutual respect. The future was unwritten, and he held the quill gently, mindful of each stroke. In September of 1493, Columbus sailed again, this time at the head of a grand fleet. 17 ships followed his lead, their sails catching the wind in graceful rhythm. They carried settlers, supplies, and hopes anew. But this journey, and those that followed, would grow more complex. Encounters with the indigenous peoples would not always be peaceful, and misunderstandings would cast long shadows. Columbus would make 3 more voyages, each filled with new discoveries and new challenges. He explored the coasts of Central and South America, always seeking a passage to Asia, but he never realized he had touched the shores of a vast new continent, one that stretched far beyond imagination. In later years, the world's view of Columbus would shift. His name would carry both honor and controversy, and his legacy would be examined, questioned, and debated. But in his lifetime, he remained a man of the sea, guided by quiet belief, curiosity, and courage. He died in 1506, not in fanfare, but in the peaceful company of family, still convinced he had opened a new way to Asia. History would later reveal the true breadth of his discovery, but even then, Columbus's role was clear. He had taken a bold first step into a wider world, and so the tale of Cristopher Columbus, from Genoa's gentle shores to the distant islands beyond the Atlantic, lives on, not as a tale of glory or conquest, but as a story of navigation, dreams, and the ever-whispering sea, guiding those who listen with patience and wonder. As the echoes of Columbus's voyage slowly settled across distant shores, centuries passed, bringing with them new stories, new dreams, and new beginnings. Now, let us turn the page gently and drift toward another time of quiet change, the dawn of the French Revolution. In the late 1700s, France rested quietly under the golden sunlight of tradition. The countryside stretched wide with gentle hills, vineyards rolled through the landscape like green waves, and the scent of baking bread drifted through small stone villages. Life moved slowly in rural France, where farmers rose with the sun, tilled the land, and shared meals of fresh cheese and hearty loaves at day's end. It was a place of rhythm and routine, where seasons guided the flow of life. At the heart of this nation stood Paris, the cultural soul of France. With its grand boulevards and candlelit salons, the city hummed with elegance. Horse-drawn carriages clicked softly along cobbled streets, and the soft notes of harpsichords floated through windows from drawing rooms where powdered wigs and silk garments were worn with quiet pride. France was a country known for beauty in art, architecture, and fashion. To walk its streets was to feel surrounded by refinement, even if it was a refinement that not all could reach. But underneath the surface, the structure of France rested on an old and delicate balance. Society was divided into three distinct groups, or estates. The first estate, the clergy, lived in a world of prayers and quiet rituals, presiding over churches and cathedrals that stretched toward the heavens. They guided the spiritual life of the nation with soft chants and flickering candles. The second estate, the nobility, held vast lands and ancient titles. They attended royal courts, gave polite bows, and lived in elegant chateaus surrounded by forests and fountains. The third estate, however, made up the overwhelming majority of the population. These were the farmers, bakers, merchants, and craftsmen, the people who turned wheels, baked bread, and built the homes. Some were comfortable, owning small shops or land, while others labored with little to spare. But even among the simplest homes, there was a quiet pride passed down through generations. Families shared stories by firelight, sang softly in the evenings, and looked to the future with cautious hope. Presiding over all was the monarchy. King Louis XVI, with his gentle voice and thoughtful demeanor, ruled from the Palace of Versailles. The palace itself shimmered like a dream, its mirrors, gardens, and fountains seeming to float in a world untouched by time. Life at court was guided by rituals, long, graceful meals, formal greetings, and gentle music. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, lived a life of delicate beauty, surrounded by silks, perfumes, and flowers. From a distance, the monarchy appeared serene and eternal, like the rhythm of the seasons. Yet, beneath this gentle surface, quiet murmurs had begun to rise. The kingdom's finances were strained, stretched by wars and expenses. Taxes weighed heavily on the third estate, while the nobility and clergy lived with relative ease. Still, for many years, this balance held, fragile yet unbroken. Ideas, like soft breezes, began drifting in from beyond France's borders. In the cafes of Paris, over cups of warm chocolate or strong coffee, writers and thinkers began to speak of liberty, of fairness, and of reason. These were not angry voices, but calm and curious ones. They asked questions with care. What is justice? What is equality? What is the true purpose of government? Books by thinkers such as Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu were passed from hand to hand, read aloud in quiet corners of libraries, and discussed with polite excitement in salons. It was as if a candle had been lit in the mind of France, glowing softly but steadily. But still, in 1788, most people did not speak of revolution. They spoke of harvests, of upcoming markets, of marriages and songs. Life continued gently, as it had for generations. Children played in the fields, nuns tended gardens and monastery walls, and painters captured the golden light that danced upon riverbanks. And yet, the air had changed, ever so slightly, as if something once asleep had begun to stir, not with thunder or shouting, but with a quiet breath, a thought, a question, a whisper that perhaps the world could be made anew. This was France on the eve of revolution, not a place of noise and flames, but a land of beauty, tradition, and slow awakening. The world was still peaceful. The storm had not yet arrived, but in the silence, something gentle had begun to shift. As the 1780s unfolded, France moved forward in its graceful rhythms, yet subtle changes continued to take root. In quiet drawing rooms and modest homes, new ideas began to blossom, not as shouts, but as thoughtful conversations. The people of France, especially those in the Third Estate, were beginning to wonder, with calm and careful voices, about fairness, responsibility, and the shape of their society. The financial situation of the kingdom had grown delicate. France had spent generously in recent years, including support for the American colonies in their own revolution across the ocean. Though the cause had seemed noble and just, the cost had weighed heavily. The crown found itself in debt, and the treasury's coffers, once echoing with abundance, had grown quiet. To balance this burden, taxes were needed, but the system was uneven. The First and Second Estates, despite their land and status, contributed little in comparison to the Third. It was the farmers, shopkeepers, and workers who bore the weight. They paid taxes on salt, on land, on bread. These burdens were accepted for a time, for duty, for country, and for tradition. But as prices rose and wages stagnated, questions followed. In 1787, King Louis XVI called together the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of nobles and clergy to help solve the financial challenges. The meeting was held with formality and courtesy. Robes swished through the halls of Versailles, and soft voices debated the matters at hand. Yet no clear solution emerged. The idea of taxing the upper estates was met with resistance, gently but firmly. They suggested broader consultation, and so attention turned to a different path. In 1788, the king agreed to convene the Estates General, a historic assembly not called for over 170 years. It was a decision made with care and hope, not knowing what it would come to mean. The Estates General would bring together representatives from all three estates to discuss, to debate, and perhaps to find a path forward for France. As word of the upcoming assembly spread, towns and villages stirred with quiet anticipation. Across the countryside, people began to gather in local meetings to choose their representatives. These gatherings were often modest, held in churches, inns, or open squares. Farmers, millers, and merchants raised their hands, offered suggestions, and wrote down their thoughts in simple notebooks called cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances and hopes. These cahiers were not full of rage. They asked gently for more fairness, for the price of bread to remain within reach, for justice to be less distant, and for taxes to be more evenly shared. They spoke of a desire for dignity and voice, not revolt, but reform. Meanwhile, in the cities, Enlightenment thinkers continued to share their vision. Their books and pamphlets floated through the streets like autumn leaves, quiet, numerous, and full of potential. These writings did not demand destruction. They offered reason, structure, and ideas about how society might serve all people more equally. The salons of Paris buzzed with these thoughts, not with the noise of crowds, but with a soft cadence of discussion. A philosopher might explain the idea of a social contract while sipping wine under the flicker of candlelight. A poet might share verses about justice, freedom, or hope. These were not the cries of battle, they were the lullabies of change, gentle, persistent, and sincere. The clergy, too, held varied views. Many parish priests, living close to the lives of ordinary people, sympathized with their needs. They saw hunger in their communities and heard the voices of farmers and widows. Among them grew a quiet understanding that the old ways might need to bend. In the spring of 1789, delegates began to journey to Versailles. From provinces far and near they came, some on horseback, some in wagons, others on foot. Their clothes reflected their station, but all carried the same sense of purpose. Something was shifting, and they were to be part of it. The Palace of Versailles, usually serene in its routines, prepared to receive them. Gardens were tended, halls swept clean, and chambers readied for what was to come. The Estates General was to begin in May, and for the first time in generations, all of France would have a voice in one room. The stage was nearly set. No banners were raised, no drums were beaten. There was only a steady hum of pens on paper, of wheels turning slowly over roads, and of hearts beating with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The seeds of change had been planted, watered by reason and tended by quiet courage. They began to grow, not suddenly, but slowly, gently, in the rich soil of a country ready for renewal. On a soft spring morning in May of 1789, the grounds of Versailles were filled with the gentle rustle of footsteps and the murmur of anticipation. Delegates from across France had arrived to take part in the Estates General, a gathering long absent from the life of the nation. They came not as warriors or protesters, but as neighbors and citizens, bringing with them quiet hopes for a better future. The hall was grand and solemn, filled with the calm dignity of history. The First Estate, dressed in clerical robes of black and white, took their seats. The Second Estate, adorned in velvets and lace, settled with grace. The Third Estate, a mixture of merchants, lawyers, and farmers, entered with modest garments, but steady eyes. Though their clothing differed, their purpose was shared, to help guide France through a time of uncertainty. But the balance was delicate. Each estate was given one vote, and so the voices of the many in the Third Estate were often outweighed by the few in the First and Second. As discussions began, it became clear that change would not come easily. In the weeks that followed, the delegates of the Third Estate grew thoughtful. They spoke softly of equality, of fairer representation, and of the need for reform. On June 17th, after careful consideration and respectful dialogue, they took a calm and historic step. They declared themselves the National Assembly, stating that they represented the people of France as a whole. Their action was not made in anger, but in conviction. It was a moment of clarity, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. 2 days later, joined by sympathetic members of the clergy, they gathered once more. But when they arrived at their meeting hall, they found the doors locked. Undeterred, they walked quietly to a nearby indoor tennis court, a simple space filled with echoes of play and sport. There, under the open rafters and flickering light, they made a solemn promise, the tennis court oath. With calm voices and hands raised, they vowed not to separate until a new constitution had been established for France. It was a gesture of unity and determination, not of force. The image of their raised hands would later become a symbol of peaceful resolve, captured in paintings and remembered in silence. Elsewhere in France, the mood began to shift. The countryside listened attentively. In Paris, the air felt different, filled not with fear, but with the hum of change. People gathered in cafes and on street corners, sharing news and thoughts with gentle excitement. On July 14th, a group of Parisians approached the Bastille, a fortress that stood as a symbol of royal authority. The sky was pale, the summer air warm. The gathering was not led by soldiers or commanders, but by townspeople, ordinary men and women seeking arms and answers. The Bastille was lightly guarded, and after a brief encounter, the fortress was opened. Inside, they found only a handful of prisoners. There was no great clash, no sweeping victory, and yet this moment would mark a turning point, a peaceful spark that signaled the start of something new. In the days that followed, the streets of Paris remained calm. The king, upon hearing the news, chose a measured response. He withdrew troops from the capital and acknowledged the National Assembly. In this quiet acceptance, the revolution took its first steps without thunder, but with purpose. Across the country, small communities began to mirror this change. Local governments were formed, feudal rights were reconsidered, and the people, once subjects, began to see themselves as citizens. The transition was not without challenge, but it unfolded like a sunrise, slow, steady, and full of light. Artists began to paint new symbols, the tricolor flag of blue, white, and red, the figure of Mary Ann, representing liberty, and scenes of people working and learning together. Songs were written, not of war, but of freedom and fraternity. France was awakening, not with rage, but with reason. The people had found their voice, and they used it with care. They spoke not of destruction, but of building a society where all could be heard. The revolution had begun, not with fire, but with faith in a better tomorrow. And as the days passed, the streets of Paris remained alive with thoughtful steps, open conversations, and a quiet confidence that something important had begun. A new chapter was being written, gently, deliberately, and with the hope that it would lead to a more just and peaceful world. As the summer of 1789 deepened, the air in France grew warmer, not only in temperature, but in spirit. The revolution, now gently unfolding, brought with it a fresh breeze of possibility. The people, from city streets to rural pastures, began to feel something they had not felt in generations, that they were shaping their own destiny. In the calm light of August, the National Assembly gathered in thoughtful discussion. The atmosphere was filled with purpose, yet remained composed. Delegates listened with care and spoke with dignity. On the night of August 4th, a significant decision was made, one that rippled quietly through the country. The Assembly chose to abolish the feudal privileges of the nobility and clergy. The old order based on birth and title was set aside with respect and solemnity. This choice was not met with loud celebration, but with a deep and peaceful sense of renewal. In small villages where peasants had long paid dues and carried obligations to landlords, change arrived like a long-awaited letter. The past was not forgotten, but the future had opened. Later that same month, the Assembly produced one of its most cherished contributions, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. A document born from calm intellect and sincere belief, it stated that all men were born free and equal in rights. It spoke of liberty, property, and security, not as privileges for a few, but as natural gifts for all. The words were read aloud in homes and classrooms under lantern light and morning sun. They became a gentle promise whispered across the nation. For many, they were more than ink on paper. They were a lullaby of fairness, composed in careful thought and noble intention. King Louis XVI, observing these changes, responded with measured hesitation. He did not act in anger, but rather with uncertainty. He recognized the desire for reform, but remained connected to the traditions of monarchy. His relationship with the Assembly was marked by quiet tension, not of open conflict, but of differing visions for France. In October, the people of Paris, many of them women concerned about the rising price of bread, gathered and began a peaceful march to Versailles. Their steps were slow and steady. Their voices, though determined, carried no shouts of violence. Upon reaching the palace, they requested that the king return to Paris, closer to the heart of the people. The king agreed. He and his family moved to the Tuileries Palace, where they lived under the watch of the Assembly and the citizens. It was a symbolic gesture marking a new connection between ruler and nation. The monarchy was still intact, but now it walked beside the people. In the following months, thoughtful reforms continued. The Assembly reorganized the church, reduced noble influence, and restructured provinces into more equal districts. Each change was made with deliberation and hope, not to erase the past, but to shape a more balanced present. Education was encouraged, trade was opened, laws were written with simplicity and clarity. The calendar remained the same, but the spirit of the times felt new. Artists captured the moment in soft pastels and calm compositions. Writers described the beauty of this rebirth with gentle prose. Musicians composed melodies that lifted the heart without stirring alarm. And while debates continued, as they always do in growing democracies, they were conducted in the spirit of shared progress. Differences were not battles, but conversations. Outside of France, other nations watched with quiet curiosity. Some rulers felt unease, others admiration. But within France, there was a calm certainty that something meaningful was taking root. As 1790 arrived, a feeling of civic pride gently bloomed. Citizens planted trees in village squares as symbols of liberty. Public festivals held in open fields and town centers celebrated unity with simple music and dances. Banners waved, children laughed, and elders nodded with quiet approval. France was not yet settled, and the path ahead was still winding. But the direction had been chosen not by decree, but by collective will. A new France had emerged, not born in thunder, but in thoughtful determination. And in the stillness of the countryside, as stars blinked gently above tiled rooftops and grassy hills, one could sense the calm hum of a nation learning to govern itself, patiently lovingly, and with enduring care. As the 1790s unfolded, the rhythms of French life continued to shift, slowly, steadily, with a sense of unfolding purpose. The revolution, no longer a distant notion, was becoming part of daily reality. Across towns and villages, people learned to navigate their new roles as citizens, not merely as subjects. It was a peaceful transformation for many, one marked by community meetings, local celebrations, and a renewed sense of shared identity. The monarchy, still present, now existed within new boundaries. King Louis XVI remained, yet his power had grown more symbolic than absolute. He walked through gardens and greeted officials, his presence respectful and restrained. His family adapted quietly to their new surroundings in Paris, living with decorum inside the Tuileries Palace. Their daily lives became more modest, more reflective of a nation turning gently toward equality. The National Assembly continued its work, crafting laws and policies that echoed the will of the people. These laws were not perfect, nor were they all immediately successful, but they were made with sincerity. Representatives debated with calm voices, weighing the needs of farmers, tradespeople, and artisans alike. It was not a time of fast decisions, but of deliberate thought, a time to shape a society built on balance and reason. Beyond the walls of the assembly, life carried on. Bakers kneaded dough each morning. Cobblers mended shoes in warm afternoon light. Children walked to school under the watchful gaze of their parents. These ordinary routines were gently touched by extraordinary change as people began to understand that their voices mattered in shaping their nation. In quiet corners of the countryside, elders gathered in shaded courtyards, speaking softly of the changes they had seen. Some remembered the old ways with fondness. Others embraced the new ideals with cautious optimism. Most, however, agreed on one thing. France had begun something rare, a transformation not just of government, but of spirit. There were challenges, of course. Food shortages still appeared in certain regions. The pace of reform sometimes led to uncertainty. Disagreements arose, as they do in any evolving society, but the overarching mood remained one of steady hope. People continued to write letters, attend gatherings, and share news in local cafes. The fabric of community, though stretched in places, remained intact. Elsewhere in the world, the French Revolution inspired reflection. In small reading rooms in London, Vienna, and Philadelphia, thinkers discussed the events unfolding across the Channel. Some admired the courage of the French people. Others questioned what might come next. But all recognized that something quietly profound was happening, a nation redefining itself, not with conquest, but with conversation. One of the most symbolic moments of this period came in July of 1790, during the Fête de la Fédération, a grand, peaceful celebration of unity held on the Champ de Mars in Paris. Under calm skies, thousands of citizens gathered to honor the shared spirit of the revolution. Delegates from across France stood side by side, joined by King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. They took part in a solemn oath, pledging loyalty to the nation, the laws, and the king, now a constitutional monarch. The scene was one of harmony, filled with gentle music, shared meals, and quiet pride. It was a vision of what the new France could become, a nation of shared responsibilities rooted in mutual respect. As the sun set over the gathering, lanterns were lit, casting a soft glow across the field. Families returned to their homes with a sense of belonging. The celebration did not mark an ending, but a continuation. A reminder that revolutions need not always burn with fire. Some, instead, can move forward with grace, one step at a time. In time, the path of the French Revolution would grow more complex. Future chapters would bring new debates, new leaders, and new directions. But in this moment, in these early measured years, France stood as a gentle example of possibility. It was a reminder that meaningful change can arise not only from upheaval, but from thoughtful, collective care, from quiet voices, from shared meals, from the patient work of people who believed in something better. And as twilight settled across the rooftops and rivers of France, the world watched and listened as a new kind of revolution unfolded, not in fury, but in peace.